Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Curious Case of Science, where curiosity meets critical thinking. I'm your host, Jon Guy, author of Think Straight and Owner's Manual for the Mind, and contributing author to Investigating Clinical Psychology. Today, we're going to be talking about pseudoscience in health and wellness, and we have an excellent panel of amazing guests who will be diving deep into wellness woo. Joining me today is my co-host, David Burke, who is no stranger to the world of scientific skepticism and pseudoscientific controversies.
Hi, I'm Dave, and I run a non-profit organization called the Vaccination Station, which promotes vaccines and other forms of science-based healthcare.
Thank you, Dave, and welcome to all of our guests. We have an excellent panel today. We are going to start off with Annie McCubbin. She is an actor. She is a behavioral science communicator. She's a speaker and she's a writer. She's written 2 books, Why Smart Women Buy the Lies and How Critical Thinking Can Protect Them, which won the Best Business Audiobook of the Year in 2021, and Why Smart Women Buy the Lies and How Critical Thinking Can Reveal the Truth. Annie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
And we're happy to have you. And
Thank you.
today, Annie is going to be talking about one fact and one myth. And her myth is a woman's intuition is a connector to her higher self, and she should trust her gut, especially when it comes to well-being.
So now we women, our intuitions are not to be trifled with. Since the dawn of time, women have known that we can trust our gut. Our gut is connected to our higher self and can guide us if we just sit in our own truth and listen to it. The expression, "I can feel it in my waters," applies to women only. Our intuition is a gift. So a friend of mine developed intractable nausea. So after a consult with her GP, Dr. Grant, who thought it might be reflux and put her onto a Nexium, which didn't quite hit the spot, she spoke to a friend, Alice, who said, "Listen, I know a brilliant naturopath who sought it." So she went along to Naomi, the naturopath, who was very friendly and listened intently to her story. She felt instinctively safe with her. She felt her concerns were validated. She had much more time for her than Dr. Grant. Naomi, the naturopath, recommended that she cut out bread and eat ancient grains. So she went to Whole Foods, where she found organic ancient grains, which she felt intuitively good about, because they brought to mind shepherds in the Peruvian hills around Machu Picchu, picking organic grains in the waning light of day, accompanied by their Peruvian alpacas. These grains made her feel she was at one with nature, the way Gaia intended it. She swore off toast, the bread baked in some factory, the toaster requiring electricity to power it. It all felt so modern, so processed. Better to stick with foods that were in tune with nature and her body. Naomi also put her on some supplements, which were all natural, and she felt intuitively had to be better for her than something from Big Pharma. Now, women we know are really good at forming connections and building community. So when the supplements didn't quite hit the spot, that was okay, because by now she was part of a warm, supportive tribe of like-minded women. These women all shared a distrust of modern medicine and listened to their bodies and trusted their instincts when it came to themselves and their children, which made intuitive sense to her. None of them vaccinated their children. They agreed quite sensibly that if children are brought up in a clean environment with safe drinking water, they don't need to put toxic chemicals into their little bodies. Children's immune systems, if well supported, don't need vaccines. A mother's instincts trumps anything that doctors can come up with. They would decide what goes into their children's bodies, not a bunch of doctors who are in the pocket of Big Pharma. It felt good to be part of a cohort who weren't a bunch of compliant sheep. So the nausea persisted, but Melissa knew this great holistic healer. So she goes to Alan, the healer, who has great certainty and confidence and was a lot more positive than the GP. She could sense the vibe as soon as she walked into his garage. She felt intuitively that she was with someone who was in the wellness space for the greater good. Not for him, a big, expensive, swanky office paid for him by being in the pocket of Big Pharma. No, he had nothing to prove. She could sense the genuine care on his face. After reading her meridians, which he reported were completely out of alignment, no wonder she felt ill. Being out of alignment felt intuitively awful. He recommended that she immediately detox. Go off dairy, gluten, and coffee, except coffee enemas, because coffee administered rectally is fine. He puts her on a paleo diet, his own line of supplements, and prescribed ice baths. She felt intuitively positive about the healer. He's offering her something natural. And the paleo diet is how people survived in the olden days, so it felt instinctively right. The paleo diet didn't quite hit the spot, and she developed transient global amnesia from the ice baths. But the amnesia eventually passed, and when she spoke to Alan the healer, he said that the amnesia was her way of forgetting her true self. This made sense to her. Everything was energy, he said. He could see her auras. She had way too much dark red. Her friend Emily was very sympathetic. I know a great Chinese herbalist and acupuncturist, she said. Acupuncture and Chinese herbs are the key. So she went to Karen, the Chinese herbalist acupuncturist, whose walls were comfortingly lined with neat wooden boxes, all full of healing herbs. Karen said her chakras were out of whack. She said to Karen that Alan the healer had said her meridians were out of alignment. And was that the same thing? Karen took her hand gently. No, she said. Meridians are totally different to chakras, but she said, you're in the right place now. So she lay down on Karen's bed and received the needles. She could feel the healing. People have been using these medicines for thousands of years. Why go somewhere modern and untested? She could feel the ancient wisdom working its magic. Finally, she was in the right place. Everything was going to be fine. She could feel it in her waters.
Wow, that was fantastic. That was, yes, very, very well done.
I was captivated.
I don't know if really, I don't know if another story could fit more woo into it. That was wonderful. Yeah, we can we've got a couple minutes. We can turn this over to the panel for discussion. One of the things that you touched on that I thought might be a good topic for discussion is, why do we see that all the time, the appeal to nature fallacy.
Yeah.
Maybe the panel can touch on, why is it an appeal? Why is it so appealing?
I'm happy to chat a little bit about this. I'm Rina Raphael. I'm a journalist. I wrote a book called The Gospel of Wellness that touches upon why so many women are attracted to wellness and alternative health methods. I think it's quite simple in the sense that we kind of worship nature in our culture, and this is nothing new. It's always been like that. Look at some of our most revered poets, our most revered authors. They all talk about being in touch with nature. And it's also something that a lot of us are barred from these days. I think if you speak to any person, they'll tell you, I'm a slave to my laptop, to my desk. I never get to go outside. There is this fixation with nature that goes back centuries. And it just makes kind of sense. I think a lot of times the interest in these sort of treatments or alternative methods are kind of based on exacting things where you just imagine that nature is better. And it's also the way oftentimes it's marketed. It's used words like pure, holistic, versus sort of, man-made stuff, which is kind of sometimes called like chemical, and it has more sort of negative connotations. But yeah, I think it's as simple as, like, we love nature, we love going on hikes, and wouldn't we want the same out of all of our medicine or all of our treatments? And I'd love, if I could, I'd love to add one more thing that she touched upon that I thought was really, really telling. She mentioned the fact that this person was very much attracted to this sort of community. And I think that's a really, really big part of why people are attracted to alternative medicine and wellness spheres. There is such a loneliness epidemic. People are dying to be part of a community. And especially now when there's such sort of faltering trust in institutions, the idea that you will gain a community, a sisterhood, people who will be there for you and who will listen to you when you're going through chronic conditions or have something that's wrong with you. That is not something that people generally get from their doctor. If they're with their doctor, they maybe get at most 12 minutes, maximum 17 minutes. So this idea that there's a group of women who will listen to you and be part of your journey towards betterness is really, really alluring, and I would say almost necessary to some people. So I have a lot of sympathy for a lot of these women who find these communities because they so desperately need it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Does anyone have any strategies that they use for talking about the appeal to nature with their friends or their colleagues? If somebody says, well, I'm not going to use this particular product, or I don't want to eat this particular food because it's not natural. Do you have any ways or like tried and tested methods that you might use to kind of address that kind of thing, or do you just steer clear of discussing it?
For me, I kind of have a list of canned examples about things that are natural that are terrible and things that are unnatural that are great. Like, chemotherapy is very unnatural by most woo pushers standards, and it doesn't, it's not inherently without risk, but it's a net benefit. And then there's things that are natural, like snake bites or arsenic or whatever. There's all kinds of things that are natural that are positively poisonous or venomous or harmful in some way. Earthquakes are quite natural, and they do a tremendous amount of damage. It does not help on social media because there's no rapport there with those people. They don't care. You're immediately going to be written off as a shill or something. But in personal life, I found that quite useful.
Yeah, I think those are great examples. And one strategy I used to use when I teach critical thinking and I start talking about logical fallacies, I use the example of glucose with some of my students, because Nick Tiller, I'm an exercise scientist at Harvard UCLA, and my whole discipline is looking at sort of exercise and health and fitness particularly. And so when I'm teaching this stuff, I give the example of a glucose molecule, one that is completely natural. Maybe it's extracted from a plant. And if you looked at this glucose molecule under a very, very high powered microscope, you'd see it has the chemical structure C6H12O6. So it's has 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygen atoms. And if you were to ingest this thing, it would have a certain effect on the body. It might cause your blood sugar levels to raise by some negligible amount, and it would cause an insulin response. Now, if you got another glucose molecule that was synthesized in a lab, something that was absolutely synthetic, and you looked at it under a high-powered microscope, it would have the exact same chemical structure, and it would have the exact same effect on the body when you ingested it. And then I do a poll with the class, and I say, how many of you would rather consume the natural sugar? And they all put their hands up, and nobody wants to touch the synthetic glucose, even though I've just explained to them that it's chemically identical and it's going to have an identical effect on the body. But for me, that little thought experiment cuts to the core of the irrationality around the bias, and the fact that actually when you follow it through to its logical conclusion, there is no logical or rational reason to prefer the natural product over the synthetic one.
That's a fantastic point. So I'm going to move right on now to Annie's fact. And Annie's fact is intuition is merely another brain function and therefore subject to cognitive flaws. Alternative medicine exploits this vulnerability.
So time to fess up. The woman trawling her nausea around to all the alternative medicine types was me. In my defense, it was about 25 years ago before I'd worked out that the promises offered to me by the alternative medicine practitioners were empty, and my intuitive response to them was misguided, and I'm not alone. Because of our brain's capacity to mislead us, we are putty in the hands of these alternative healers. Our intuition, which feels so right, is leading us sadly in the wrong direction. So why and how do we end up trusting people who are costly both financially and emotionally, and downright dangerous in terms of our health? Well, it starts out with the idea that we make rational, sensible choices, and our intuition is to be trusted. Women are especially fed the message that their intuition is connected to their higher selves and should always be listened to. This couldn't be further from the truth. Of all the human impulses that is inappropriately elevated to an unassailable spiritual truth, it's intuition. In fact, intuition is just a fancy word for memory. And being just another part of our brain function is just as prone to error as other parts of our brain. And trusting your intuition across the board can result in disastrous outcomes. Trusting my intuition sent me on a wild ride. I started in a state of high optimism that Alan the healer would be the one to fix my issue, and then succumb to the inevitable disappointment that it hadn't worked. But that was okay, because there's a veritable feast of alternative medicine providers ready to push their untested, invalid products and services onto unsuspecting, vulnerable patients. Our brains are buggy and awash with cognitive flaws, which allow us to be fooled by people like Alan. You walk into Alan's suburban garage. I'm using Alan as a proxy for all med practitioners. And he looks up at you with his steady, penetrating gaze and tells you with his deep, sonorous voice that he understands what's wrong with you and that he can fix it. Your brain, unbeknownst to you, does a rapid fire search through the filing cabinet in a dusty corner of your brain and comes up with a memory where Alan's smile, his appearance, the sound of his voice match the features of someone you've trusted in the past. Consistency bias, confirmation bias, argument from authority bias hijack your thinking, and bingo, we call this an intuition. Your critical thinking goes out the window, and Alan is gifted all the credibility and trust he needs to pull the wool over your eyes. Your poor brain never had a chance. The cherry on the cake is the fact that we are tribally brained. Alice, Melissa, and Emma all love Alan. So motivated reasoning enters stage left, cleverly dressed up as your intuitive response. To remain part of the in-group, you're motivated to believe that Alan's the real deal. And this in-group now includes social media. The Dunbar number, proposed by psychologist Robin Dunbar, posits our brains can maintain tribes of 150 people. So thanks to social media, our tribe has now extended to 45,000 million people or some such number. So we're not only dealing with Alan and his ilk, we have Jasmine and her influencer buddies pushing their untested organic supplement powder, which will boost your immune system, heal your gut, and increase your fitness, which is all code for getting thin anyway. And any spark of skepticism is vanquished by their charm and certainty and flat abs. And our besieged brain, led by the misplaced confidence of our intuition, puts in our credit card details and waits for the transformative miracle powder to arrive. Meanwhile, our confidence in Dr. Grant is plummeting. Unlike Alan, who is a master of certainty, Dr. Grant's ministrations seem tentative. He wants to send us for tests, give us drugs that may or may not work. Dr. Grant, of course, understands that humans are complex and highly individual beings. And when something goes awry with our health, diagnosis is not always easy. But under the thrall of Alan and Jasmine, drugs are off the table. Not for you being in the pocket of Big Pharma. You will only put natural products into your body, which brings us to one of the most insidious biases, which we've already mentioned, the appeal to nature bias, where anything natural is good for you and anything unnatural is not. This is, of course, highly flawed. Being attacked by a brown bear and getting cancer are both natural and they're not ideal. In any case, supplements touted as natural come out of factories, even though your brain believes they were somehow dug out of a sunlit field and transported to you in open weave baskets by small happy gnomes on bicycles. So if I could talk to my younger self, I would say to me that it is these cognitive flaws in our brains, these fragments of shrouded memories that are disguising themselves as intuitions. Don't fall for it. Use your critical thinking skills. Stick with science. It's a lot safer and cheaper and just might save your life. Thank you.
Brilliant. I love the storytelling format of that. That was really good. And you touched on a lot of really important points. One of the things I noted that I see a lot is the dichotomy between confidence and cautious, right? A lot of people are dissuaded by the tentative approach that science-based medicine doctors take versus the confidence scheme of alternative medicine practitioners. Does anybody in the panel want to touch on that at all?
Well, I think that Annie alluded to a really crucial point here is that, and this I think was in the first part of your story, is that typically people might get somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes with their normal medical provider, with their primary care provider for any given issue. Whereas if you go and see a homeopath, you might get 20, 30 minutes. And actually, it's that pastoral care that people seem to respond to the most. So if you go and see a homeopath for something relatively benign, a benign headache or a bit of back pain, which is quite normal, or something that's going to clear up on its own, the placebo effect is very, very powerful. We know that it has enormous psychobiological effects on the body. And having this pastoral care, having more time, having somebody who cares and who's sympathetic, sometimes empathetic, that makes all the difference in the world. Whereas if you're rushed in and out of your doctor's office because they have so many patients to see, they're under crushing time pressures, then that creates this very clear distinction, this dichotomy between these alternative medicine providers and I guess science-based medicine. So I think that's a really important point.
I think we shouldn't mix up placebo effects and the effects of tender loving care. They're two different things. You have a placebo effect if you buy a homeopathic remedy in your pharmacist, and you have the positive effect of tender loving care, even if you don't get any medication and therefore don't have a placebo effect. And I think it's very important to differentiate the two.
Yeah, and of course, an idea. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And ideally, when somebody goes and sees their primary care provider, their physician, they would ideally get tender loving care as well. They would they would have the best of both. They'd have the science-based treatment, and they'd have somebody who takes the time to listen to them and is able to provide them with that sort of almost emotional support. Unfortunately, they don't always get the time to do both.
Yeah, I think Guy P. Harrison makes a really good point in one of his books that's this you walk into the office and it's it smells like aromas and you're greeted by a bubbly nurse who wants to give you a lot of time, whereas you walk into a hospital and it's kind of feels like a jail and the walls are all the same color and it has a weird smell and there's definitely things that could be incorporated to make it you feel like you're getting that loving, caring approach where we otherwise don't.
Okay, our next panelist is Dr. Edzard Ernst. He's an academic physician and researcher specializing in complementary medicine and also emeritus professor at the University of Exeter, where I believe, Dr. Ernst, you established the first chair in complementary medicine. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's correct, yeah.
Dr. Ernst is also the recipient of the 2015 John Maddox Prize for promoting sound science and evidence despite hostility. And if that's not a sign of our times, I don't know what is. Dr. Ernst will be speaking firstly on his myth that alternative medicine is gentle and safe.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And I think I start by trying to define what we are talking about. Alternative medicine, nobody has defined it, and it's probably a good idea to define it. Having said that, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of definitions, and none of them is really satisfactory. So I usually define it as the type of healthcare that is not used in conventional medicine. That is also pretty unsatisfactory, but it's a simple definition that helps people to understand what we're talking about. Terminology, we talk about alternative medicine, and that probably is an awful term for it, because it's not an alternative. If something doesn't work, it cannot possibly be an alternative to healthcare. And if something does work, and I ought to stress that some alternative treatments do work, if something works, it should be evidence-based medicine. And therefore, for many years now, I have called it so-called alternative medicine, not least because that lends itself to a very nice abbreviation, namely SCAM. So I call it scam. Scam is very popular, as we all know. It varies from country to country, and it varies from population to population. General populations, for instance, in the United States, about 33% use at least one form of scam per year. In other countries, Germany, where I was born, it's much higher, 75%. And people ask me often why these differences exist. Why the Germans are supposed to be rational thinkers. Why do they use so much scam? The reason for that isn't simple. There are dozens of determinants for the popularity of scam. And one of these determinants that I'm going to talk about a little bit now is that they're supposed to be gentle, safe, and by that, it is implied already that conventional medicine is not gentle and is not safe. So that's a very nice marketing gimmick, but it's a myth. We've looked at dozens of different scams, and we find that almost all of them have what I call direct risks. The risk caused directly by the intervention. Take acupuncture, for instance. People say acupuncture is entirely safe. A little pinprick into the skin, but that's all. It's not true. If you do the research, you find that 10% of people have side effects, which admittedly are minor, like pain, and short-lasting. But 10% is pretty much. If you look at aspirin, it's far less than 10%. In addition to that, acupuncture causes very severe complications. The needle can go into a vital organ, most often into the lungs. And if it is done properly in traditional acupuncture, symmetrically on both sides of the thorax, then it can go into both lungs, and then you're pretty much dead. Unless you're close to an intensive care unit. So the risks are not negligible, even for acupuncture. Take herbal medicine. There it depends really very, very much on which herb you're talking about. Some herbs admittedly are quite safe. Chamomile, for instance. Some herbs are deadly, like hemlock. With herbal remedies, we have to think of interactions. Think of St. John's wort, which is well documented, and I use it as an example of an evidence-based alternative treatment. It's effective for mild to moderate depression, but it interacts with about 50% of prescription drugs in the way that it lowers the blood level of these prescription drugs. So women can get pregnant while taking St. John's wort because the anti-baby pill doesn't work. More seriously, people who receive treatment for after heart transplants or any organ transplant can have a rejection reaction of these organs. In addition to these direct risks, and I could go on, I've just mentioned two examples. In addition to these direct risks, we have something that is much more important, namely the indirect risk of scam, so-called alternative medicine. And by that, I mean the risk not directly associated with the treatment, but with the whole setup, the whole scenario. Let's think of homeopathy, for instance. Homeopathy, the typical homeopathic remedy doesn't contain anything, so it would be very surprising if it caused any harm. Therefore, we tend to think that homeopathy is completely harmless, but it's not. As soon as you advertise homeopathy for a serious condition and use it instead of conventional medicine for a serious condition, it becomes life-threatening. And there are plenty of examples for that. Usually, the best-known examples are patients who suffer from cancer, who fall victim of a homeopath who persuades them to treat their condition with homeopathy. And if you do that, it's a certain way to hasten death.
Dr. Ernst, if I can just jump in here, I think you've led us actually quite naturally to your fact, which ties in well with the central theme of your myth discussion. So if I could just ask you now to move on to your fact, which is that alternative medicine practitioners violate fundamental laws of ethics, which, as I understand, is basically what you're moving into now with the discussion of the practices that are used and why they are so perilous.
Yeah, right. Okay, I'll do that. When we talk about ethics, we think of Hippocrates, who said, "First, do no harm," and all medical students are supposed to give an oath to Hippocrates, both of which is wrong. The Hippocrates never actually formulated "first do no harm." It's not in his oath, that sentence. And as medical students, we never swear that we first do no harm. We cannot do that because we do a lot of harm. In any invasive treatment in a way does harm, and if there had been an oath for medical students, it would be always do more good than harm. Anyway, medical ethics center around these two themes: doing good and doing harm, and a third principle is the autonomy, the respect for the rights of the patient. And that is what I'm trying to focus on in this very complex field of medical ethics. And I'm going to show you that alternative practitioners can only practice by violating medical ethics every day and many times over every day. I'm going to focus on informed consent. Informed consent in medical practice is a precondition for any ethical behavior. In medical school, we learn very soon that we must not treat a patient without informed consent. It is really a very, very important principle of medical practice. So imagine somebody going to a homeopath, and let's say this person suffers from a headache, and he has an appointment with the homeopath takes a lengthy history. It has been mentioned already that his history taking is lengthy. In my experience, it can take a first consultation with a homeopath can take up to 1 hour. And of course, the patient feels warmly understood because the homeopath would ask questions that no medic has ever asked before about what makes the headache worse, what are the favorite foods, is it worse with full moon or waning moon, etc., etc. So some relevant questions, some not so relevant questions. And then eventually the homeopath will consult his books, his memories, or his computer and find the optimal remedy that fits not just the headache of that patient, but also everything else that has come out of this long history taking. And that optimal remedy is the remedy that, if you would give it to a healthy person, would create the headache, would create all the other conditions that the patient reported. Homeopathy, in other words, work on the like cures like principle. If something causes symptoms in a healthy person, then this something, this substance, is being used to treat the symptoms in a patient. So he would give the patient the optimal remedy and say, I'm giving you that, and you take it 3 times per day for a fortnight, and then you come back to me and we'll see whether you're any better. He might add a question, if that is okay with you. And that is informed consent by a homeopath.
So, sorry, pardon me, Dr. Ernst, if I can just again jump in. So, as I understand it, the point you're making, which I think you've made very strongly, is that you cannot give informed consent to someone who is misinforming you, which is exactly what a scam is basically predicated on. Is that a fair summary?
No.
Oh.
I'm going to explain to you what informed consent would entail. It would entail explaining the diagnosis. Now, headache is not a diagnosis. Headache is a symptom. So the homeopath has no means of even finding the diagnosis, so he cannot explain the diagnosis. Informed consent would mean explaining the natural history of the condition. What, in other words, will happen if we don't treat your headache? The homeopath cannot do that because he doesn't know what the underlying condition is. Informed consent must entail explanations as to what the treatment options for the conditions are. In other words, homeopathy is not the only treatment that is supposed to be able to treat headaches. What other treatments are available for your headache? The homeopath cannot explain that because at least the non-professional, the non-medical homeopaths, like we have them in most countries, simply doesn't have the knowledge to explain that. Informed consent would entail explaining what this therapy actually is, what its nature is, what is the nature of homeopathy, what is its mode of action, for instance. Nobody knows that, not even the homeopaths. They may have some fantasy about it, but no knowledge, because There is no knowledge on this. It would necessitate explaining the effectiveness of the treatment. Now, evidence-based medicine tells us that homeopathy is not effective. So the homeopath would need to tell his patient, I'm giving you these little pills. The evidence tells us they are not effective, but hop along and take them anyway. The homeopath would need to explain the risk of taking these little pills and the costs of these little pills. That he can actually do. So some facets of the fully informed consent are possible to the homeopath, but the most crucial ones are not. And I think that example shows, it's perhaps an extreme example, but it shows that alternative practitioners, by definition, violate medical ethics through not providing proper informed consent. If they provide proper informed consent, they would at least have to tell them, the patient, this treatment that I'm giving you is not the optimal treatment. It has perhaps certain risks. Think of chiropractic or herbal medicine, as mentioned before. And if they would do that, they would lose their patients. And this is why they will never do it. And this is why, strictly speaking, alternative medicine, the practice of alternative medicine, is an unethical business. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ernst. That was extremely detailed, and I think you've covered pretty much everything we could have wanted to ask. I will just turn over to Jon now so that we can move on to our next panelist.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ernst. That was extremely informative. Our next speaker is Rina Raphael. She is an editor, a journalist, and she's an author of The Gospel of Wellness. Today, she's going to be speaking about one fact and one myth. Her myth is going to be, you can trust the top media when it comes to wellness. Rina, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Excited to be here. So I think it's apparent to everyone that you cannot open a newspaper or even listen to a podcast without hearing about this word called wellness. So you open up even top publications and women's magazines, men's magazines, and you're going to hear all about the benefits and the amazing attributes of things like IV therapy, gut boosting probiotics, CBD everything, including CBD infused leggings. In fact, it's almost becoming kind of crazy how many products are now suddenly called wellness. And you're going to find these things everywhere. So you're going to even find them in top publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. A lot of these places now have their own wellness sections, which are actually a little bit different from their health sections, or they've been rebranded health and wellness, which seems more encompassing. And especially within these publications, you're going to see a whole type of column, which are called I Tried It. So these are reporters saying, I tried this, brain boosting supplement and it worked for me. Ergo, it will work for you. I think the New York Times section even had a column that they discontinued about a year or two ago called My Detox. And it was simply interviewing influencers and noted people about how they detox. That's another word that's simply gone viral over the last few years. And I think, as a journalist who covered the wellness industry starting even 7-8 years ago, and I interviewed everyone from Gwyneth Paltrow to biohacking guru Dave Asprey, every single meditation company, supplement company, I've interviewed them. It's really fascinating to me that the number one question I am asked is, so what is wellness? There's such a confusion around this one word because it can just as easily mean meditation and yoga as it does, charcoal activated toothpaste. It can literally mean anything. And the problem is that when something means everything, it starts to mean absolutely nothing. And so we have a problem now where, obviously people are potentially a little bit more on guard when they are scrolling through Instagram or TikTok and they see something from an influencer and they kind of know in the back of their head, all right, maybe I should take this with a grain of salt. But it's a little different when you are going to top established media and you see something written there and you think, okay, this I can trust. And I'm willing to get to my fact in just a little bit, but I'd love to hear if anyone has any examples that they found truly sort of fascinating in the last few years about how maybe they saw something in the media and sort of they were a bit alarmed.
Pardon. I know that in Australia, ice baths are now absolutely de rigueur over here. Everybody has an ice bath in their backyard. And of course, they're being touted now as something that it's a cure-all for absolutely anything. It's a wellness must. It's going to cure your inflammation. And possibly it's even going to cure cancer. So something like that, which starts off as something almost, benign, which is just athletes, chucking themselves in a bit of ice, is now every second person in the area I live in has an ice bath, and apparently it cures absolutely everything. Yep.
Yeah.
Which is a wonderful example. And I think that the fact that this is something that was largely popularized by athletes, and it's good timing. I'm actually writing about ice bathing in my column for Skeptical Inquirer this month with the title that's going to be something along the lines of why are we still ice bathing? And especially for athletes, and actually there's plenty of evidence showing, if anything, it slows recovery. It actually inhibits recovery in many ways. And this has been demonstrated in very good, very high level studies. And I'm going to go into some of the mechanisms about that in my article. And it's fascinating to me that that doesn't seem to matter. The fact that we have empirical data, very good data showing that this thing doesn't work. It's the way that it's portrayed in the media and on social media in particular that actually is the much more powerful medium. So, science is sort of is quite esoteric. These scientific papers are going to be read by other scientists, most of whom are not really capable or don't have the inclination to communicate to the mainstream. So the science just kind of sits in its little cubbyhole and doesn't get translated to the athletes, and this thing becomes popular.
Well, it's Wim Hof, isn't it? Wim Hof rushing around in the Arctic
Right.
Circle or whatever he does. And people have died from it because they do the weird breathing thing as well as the ice bath thing, and then they keel over and die. So, it's not ideal.
I just want to add one other thing. Rina, I'm fascinated by your background and the fact that you were very sort of actively involved in wellness culture as a consumer, I guess, and then you sort of come more over to the more evidence-based side of things, and now you're challenging some of these practices. Is it fair to say that most news outlets and most publishers are privately owned, right? So they can report the stories that they want? And I mean, I'm thinking more specifically about, so I know that social media, for example, people are under the misapprehension that these are publicly owned companies, and they're not. They're private companies. They can, if they don't want to crack down on misinformation and pseudoscience, they don't have to. They have a moral obligation to do so. They don't have a legal obligation to do so. Is it the same for something like the New York Times?
I'm going to get into more of my background. I have a lot more to say when it comes to my fact portion. But I will say this, that there are really no sort of gatekeepers. There's no one really patrolling this. And if it is, it's scientists, and there's not that many of them. Most scientists or people who are dealing with misinformation are really busy. They don't have time to patrol everything that's being produced in media. And I can also get into the fact that there's a lot of confusion oftentimes about what is scientific, because a lot of our institutions have been compromised as well. I wrote just a few months ago about the fact that the WHO, that the World Health Organization, is now vouching for alternative medicine and for Chinese medicine. Or even the fact that we have the Cleveland Clinic now vouching for energy healing and Reiki. So when you sort of challenge a lot of these media outlets and say this is not scientific, they can just as very easily say, are you telling me the Cleveland Clinic as unscientific. And that's a whole other conversation about what's going on at those institutions. But most of the fact is that except for a couple of people on Twitter, they're not really going to get pushback because we've sort of internalized these things as truths. If you speak to, especially here in the United States, if you speak to an average woman and you say, organic is definitely healthier for you, they'll say, of course, of course, of course. Obviously supplements are good for you. Of course, of course, of course. It's been repeated so many times by the media that people just naturally believe it. And that includes editors and writers. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. Obviously, I want to get to my fact, but it's part of a bigger ecosystem of misinformation at this point.
No, I think you segued perfectly well into your fact, which I'll just introduce right now. Your fact today is that wellness is treated a lot more like fashion than it is health, and I think you're going to speak to. I think you're just going to continue on with what you were just saying with that. So go ahead.
Yes, wellness is fashion these days. It's a revolving door of new diets, ingredients, protocols, treatments. I like to remind people that 10 years ago, everyone was really obsessed with bone broth. Then it was green juice, then it was kombucha, then it was functional elixirs. Now it's sea moss smoothies. It just keeps going and going and going. And, a lot of ways it's almost like fad diets. It's this revolving carousel where there's always some new hot thing that everyone writes about. Everyone puts their hope in the next best thing. When that doesn't work out, or they buy a whole bunch of CBD creams or products and they don't work and they shove them to a drawer, they're just like, okay, what's the next big thing? Oh, it's sea moss. Okay, now everyone, let's go buy sea moss. And a lot of this has to do with just the nature of social media, and also that obviously impacts the media, legacy media, which depends on people clicking through things. Obviously, papers and algorithms reward the novel and the exciting. What's this hot new thing that people are speaking about? Tried and true advice like, hey, try to eat some more fruits and veggies, fruits and vegetables, try to get some movement. That's not going to go viral. Everyone knows this stuff. It's not ever going to go viral. But gosh, there's this new bizarre ingredient you never heard of that, is sourced from the Himalayan hills and might just, help cognitive brain function. Golly, that's exciting. And we're in this sort of moment with media where I don't think it's news to anyone that media is suffering right now. They need those clicks. They need that interest. And the hottest industry of late is wellness. It's probably even as big or bigger than beauty, fashion. It is the wellness du jour. And I'll give you an example. Before I was a health and wellness journalist, I was a fashion and beauty journalist. I worked at NBC News and at the Today Show. And all of the publicists who used to pitch me on fashion lines and sneakers and all that, they now are all basically pitching me on probiotic sodas and supplements. All of the brand strategists and publicists who used to work in those industries have all moved over to the wellness industry. So what that means is that the wellness industry is adopting the same tactics as beauty, fashion, also the alcohol industry. They're using those same exact tactics, and they're the ones who are pitching top legacy media. But there's another issue, which is that for top outlets, they're all trying to basically cater to their audiences who are interested in this, quote unquote wellness, even though it's not ever defined, and wellness is a category that keeps encompassing more and more items, more ridiculous. The fact that now skincare is now wellness is kind of ridiculous. So you have all these reporters who've migrated over from other sectors, be it tech, be it beauty, be it fashion, who are now reporting on wellness, i.e. health, but they have no health background, they have no scientific background. They don't understand, for example, that if you are writing about something like supplements, or you're talking about gut health, that you need to go and speak to experts who know that expertise. They do not know that. So for example, when you're talking about, let's say, clean beauty and potentially harmful chemicals in your products, they don't know that maybe they should speak to people who know about those chemical products. They just speak to dermatologists who may not necessarily know about that. So this is a whole bigger reason that there's just not enough training, but also anyone wants to write about it because it's treated like fashion. Now, the problem is that we're treating wellness like fashion. We're treating wellness like entertainment. Every week there's a new hot thing. And we're talking about health here. It is not entertainment. It is not fashion. It is not the same thing. So it's really become really, really problematic. And I think it's really telling that when you open up a lot of these top newspapers, you are going to find wellness in the style section. all the time. It's in the style section. It's just not taken seriously. And the other part is that a lot of these legacy medias, which are sort of, I would say, contingent on subscriptions, they're basically trying to cater to their audiences, which are usually upper middle class women. These are people who want to believe in this stuff, who have sort of the pockets to buy a bunch of these gadgets and elixirs, whatever it is, and it means nothing to them. But the problem is that it seeps down to the general audience with people who maybe don't necessarily have a lot of money. So a lot of this industry has become aspirational. It's about, you know, buying your health, about buying some new hot thing. And that trickles down to people who don't necessarily have that money and who think that they're somehow not as healthy or not taking care of their health because they can't afford all of these classes, retreats, apps, whatever it is. A really perfect example is organic. This idea that it's been repeated over and over again, that it is healthier, even though there's really not enough scientific evidence to say that it is necessarily healthier for you. It's really more about the agricultural method. What ends up happening? Lower income communities who cannot afford organic because it's sometimes even double the cost of regular produce, their reaction to this, because they've been made so terrified of the quote unquote chemicals in vegetables and fruits, they end up basically skipping the produce aisle altogether because they've been made terrified, even though those communities are already not consuming enough fruits and vegetables. So sometimes these can have harmful impacts. So I'm just going to stop there. I'll say a little bit just about myself, which is that, you know, to respond to Nick, I used to cover the wellness industry. I would say that I originally started writing and reporting a lot of these fallacies, a lot of these things that I just didn't investigate because they sounded true enough. And I will say that when the wellness industry really sort of took off 10 years ago, I think it was treated a lot like the tech industry 15, 20 years ago. When we first came in contact with social media giants, we were like, wow, this sounds great. It's going to connect everyone. This is going to be a paradise of information. And we took a lot of founders and companies at face value. We wanted to believe all of these founders who said that they were there to make the world better and happier and healthier. And now we're sort of seeing, especially, you know, my turning point was that I was a wellness industry journalist for Fast Company magazine. The more I interviewed these founders, the more I interviewed scientists, the more I got a hold of their marketing and business plans, the more I saw that there was very little, if any, scientific evidence behind a lot of these trends and products. And it was really just about selling people an aspirational lifestyle or selling them a feeling more than anything that had to do with science or health.
Yeah, I think that was a great transition. I think we have a lot of examples of people who went from being kind of enmeshed in the wellness industry, like Britt Hermes is a good example, who was a naturopath who came out of that and you know, became sort of a whistleblower in that industry. And a lot of us are extremely grateful for that, because we need that. We need more people coming from that side and kind of having that eye-opening moment where you start understanding that you have been committing fallacies, you have been spreading misinformation, which is a big pill to swallow. But having the humility and the integrity to come out of that, I think, is extremely important. We have a little bit of time left. We have about a minute for comments, if anybody wants to jump in on anything that Rina had shared.
Actually, Rina, I had a comment. You made an observation that that the wellness category has now transitioned into the style category, and I found that a really interesting point, because it strikes me that at this stage now, this is it's pretty much given up the pretense of being about health and healthcare. It's actually about conspicuous consumption. These are, as you pointed out, these are affluent people buying rich products, for expensive products for affluent people. These are not people who have urgent health needs that desperately need to be addressed by the latest health fad. These are people who are extremely healthy because they're extremely wealthy, and they have no qualms with their health, and they're buying this stuff because it is part of the in-group behavior, and they're demonstrating that they can buy it, and that this is part of that whole lifestyle package. And that, to me, that's an utterly dystopian point that we are at. This is proper late-stage capitalism stuff. But as you say, it trickles down to people who don't have that kind of money, who see this as an aspirational goal, and are now being sucked into things they cannot even afford. And that is actually the whole tragedy of the business.
Yeah, I'll just say this. Yeah, I cover that entire issue in my book, The Gospel of Wellness. And just as one example, I wrote a story for the LA Times recently about how this was even trickling down to teens and tweens. And I spoke to therapists who told me that they now have 12 and 13-year-olds who are getting stressed out about the fact that they weren't devoting enough time to their self-care and skincare masks, that they were now going to therapists talking about the fact that I don't devote enough time to being not stressed out. This idea that they had to buy, these teens had to buy all these skincare masks and they didn't have enough time to take their bubble baths and do their skincare. And we're now becoming stressed over that fact was just so ridiculous, but that's where we're at.
Okay, well, our final panelist is Dr. Nick Tiller. Dr. Tiller has a PhD in human applied physiology. He is an exercise scientist at Harvard UCLA and the author of The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. He's also a columnist at Skeptical Inquirer magazine and a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Dr. Tiller's first point is his myth, which is using complementary and alternative medicine and other placebo-based products is a local phenomenon that affects only those who use the intervention.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here on the panel, and we've covered so many important points. My myth, and I'm going to save us a bit of time here because my myth and my fact are sort of consolidated into one, and I'll just restate it. So the myth that I'd like to explore and ultimately expose is this idea that complementary alternative medicine and other placebo products, more broadly like dietary supplements and the like, are local phenomena. They affect only the individuals using the product or service. So analogous to if somebody wants to smoke a cigarette or take a drug in their own home, that they have, that they have the ability and the right to do so, and it has no far-reaching effects on the rest of society. Now, people who hold this view typically have very little patience with people like me, people like us, who tend to warn against the ongoing use of placebos. And the idiom, what's the harm, has sort of bubbled to the surface, has been developed as a catchphrase of the credulous. But I'm going to give you a few examples, some primary examples here of where this idea of what's the harm is so clearly fallacious. And it's with celebrities and high-profile athletes. So let me just give you a couple of examples here. So the first example that I always tend to talk about, Michael Phelps. Now, Michael Phelps is, for those of you who don't know, who've been living in a cave somewhere, he's an American swimmer or former swimmer. He's retired now. He's the most successful Olympic athlete in history. So not just the most successful swimmer, but the most successful athlete of all time. He's won more gold medals than anyone else. And at the 2016 Rio Olympic Games, when he came out for the Olympic swimming finals and he stripped down and he revealed these large circular bruises all across his back and shoulders. Now, this was the result of what we call cupping therapy, which is an ancient Chinese medicine. And this was the thing that I was most intrigued by. A lot of people were focusing more on his performance, but noticed these large circular bruises, and it was covered a lot in the media in subsequent days. Now, if you look at the Wikipedia page views for cupping therapy, up until the 2016 Olympic Games, they were trucking along at about 1,000, maybe 1,500 views per day. After Phelps appeared at the 2016 swimming finals, there was a huge spike in traffic to the page, reaching well over 100,000 views. So this is a wonderful example of how a high-profile athlete, one of the most high-profile athletes in the world, is in a very real way pioneering population interest in alternative therapy. And I still wonder how many individuals who visited the cupping therapy page after the games actually went on to get cupping therapy themselves. So moving on, a second example of just a more generic celebrity might be somebody like Oprah Winfrey. So she's a CAM user herself, but she's not just a user of CAM. She's also a complementary and alternative medicine enabler. So she's had a long list of guests on her show selling pseudoscience. she created the Frankenstein's monster that is Dr. Oz, who has since gone on to endorse and sell a whole litany of different alternative therapies. She platformed Jenny McCarthy to talk about anti-vaccine nonsense. And Jenny McCarthy, by the way, has talked a lot about the retracted Andrew Wakefield study showing this link between vaccines and autism, and that's sort of the basis for her rhetoric. And she also shared her platform with pseudo experts like Vani Hari, who's the food babe, who has incurred the wrath of nutritionists and dietitians around the world. Now, when the Oprah Winfrey Show was back on, this was, I think it finished in around 2010, it had an average of 20 million viewers every single day. And the stuff that she's been doing on YouTube more recently has even more followers. And the last example then, going back to the world to talk about high-profile athlete, is Cristiano Ronaldo. So he's, I don't think there's a single person in UK and Europe who doesn't know who Cristiano Ronaldo is. He might be a little bit less well known in the States. He's a Portuguese football player. He is Instagram's most influential celebrity. He has 3 times more followers than Taylor Swift, who we can't seem to get away from at the moment. But crucially, Cristiano Ronaldo, he leverages his more than 700 million followers on Instagram to sell everything from ineffective dietary supplements to widely discredited electric muscle stimulation devices. These devices where you stick electrodes on the muscle and then it causes the muscle to twitch, and it comes with all these claims that it can improve muscle mass and strength and help people to lose weight. And these are all claims that have been disproven by scientists. So the point here is that these famous athletes and celebrities are using their platforms to either deliberately or inadvertently spread pseudoscience and misinformation. They are, in a very real way, pioneering population trends in the use of alternative therapies, scam, as Dr. Ernst discussed, and other placebo products. And of course, even somebody without any social media followers can still influence those around them. So this is not a local phenomena. Placebo use and widespread acceptance of placebos bleed into all other aspects of society. It affects clinical practice. It affects population health in a very real way. And this is precisely why critical thinking and scientific skepticism are so crucial for making good decisions, especially in the world of health and wellness.
And Nick, just as you were talking about some of those examples, I just remember being at NBC News when we were covering the Olympics, all these ideas, I'm like, I remember when we covered that, and just the, when you're talking about, what's the name of the swimmer with the pad?
Michael Phelps.
Michael Phelps, that sort of stuff is it's just too good. It's just like they're gonna cover it, and no one wants to put down Michael Phelps.
Sure, Dr.
Okay.
Tiller, did you want to just add any more to your fact that embracing placebos in any domain has downstream effects on clinical practice and population health? Okay,
so in terms of how this sort of widespread acceptance of placebo practices, placebos and I guess we could talk more specifically about alternative therapies. First of all, and again, Dr. Ernst sort of touched on this, it's impossible to restrict the use of placebos to minor muscle aches and benign headaches. So, for example, Michael Phelps probably used cupping because he had some shoulder pain and wanted to use that to apparently increase blood flow to the local area and help to facilitate recovery and reduce inflammation and so forth, none of which has been demonstrated in a controlled scientific study. But other organizations suggest that cupping can be used to control asthma symptoms. And I don't think I need to go into any detail as to why it's a bad idea to use cupping to treat asthmatic symptoms. But if somebody truly believes in the healing properties of the intervention, it's only a matter of time before they use that intervention to try and manage something that needs a real medical intervention, something that is proven or at least evidence-based. So a couple of examples here, and unfortunately there are hundreds, if not thousands of examples in the scientific literature and in the mainstream media of people who have tried to use these placebo interventions to treat real medical ailments. So one was John Lawler, is an 80-year-old individual. He visited a chiropractor for some pain that he was having in his leg. He suffered a broken neck and spinal damage and very sadly passed away. This was in 2019. And chiropractic is one of those practices that is generally not evidence-based, and it's generally considered to be an alternative therapy. There was the case of Edgar Lopez, who was a diabetic, a type 1 diabetic patient, a child. Also in 2019, his parents were told by a herbalist that he shouldn't take his insulin because the insulin was actually obstructing his recovery. And the child very sadly went into a diabetic coma and died. The herbalist eventually went to prison, but in most cases, more cases than not, they are not held accountable for these kinds of actions. And the last example I'll give is Ezekiel Stephan, who was 18 months old, died from bacterial meningitis after his parents refused to take him to hospital, instead opting to treat him with herbal remedies. So these are very clear examples, just 3 of many thousands that I could have picked, that are documented actually on the website whatstheharm.net, which is very apt. And there are examples of how placebo interventions actually can have implications on clinical practice. And just in terms of population health, people use dietary supplements. Online influencers are promoting fad diets, garbage exercise programs to help people pursue health and wellness. If you look at spending in health and wellness, the industry is worth $4 trillion worldwide. And profits from the industry have been going up and up and up for the last several decades. But in every way that population health can be quantified, it's going down and down and down. So rates of obesity are higher than they've ever been. Rates of cardiovascular disease are higher. Type 2 diabetes higher than it's ever been. Mental health is lower than it's ever been. The number of people who have sadly died from suicide is increased by 13% in the last 10 years. So clearly, whatever we're spending our money on in health and wellness is not having the desired effect. So as I've said, this widespread sort of endorsement or condoning of alternative therapies and placebo medicines is having a very real downstream effect on clinical practice and population health. Thank you.
When you said what's the harm has become kind of the catastrophe of the credulous, I immediately thought of whatstheharm.net. And I'm glad you brought it up. I'll throw a link to it in the description. And like you said, there's thousands of cases on that website, and not just of direct harm, but they cover indirect harm too. They cover financial losses. If you chose one medication over another, that kind of things. It's a really, really good website, and I'll get a link to that in the description. But does anybody have anything that they want to comment?
Sorry, I have a really frightening example about the harm related to King Charles. When he first had COVID, he recovered fairly quickly, which was good. And in the Indian press, it was reported that he recovered because of homeopathy. This wasn't true. It was even denied by the palace, but it prompted the Indian government to use homeopathy for prevention and treatment of COVID. Hundreds of thousands of people died because of that.
I was just going to say that I found that polarity fascinating, that as the spend on wellness has escalated, real, in the real world, actually health outcomes are plummeting. It's just fascinating, isn't it? And terrible.
Yeah, and some people make the false connection where they think, well, okay, well, if population health is very bad, then of course they're going to spend more money on health and wellness because they want to get healthier. But if you look at the trends have been going in this direction for decades. So you'd think that if spending on health and wellness was having any positive effect, you'd start to see a plateau, at least in obesity rates, and so forth. And actually obesity now is going up exponentially. It was linear, and now it's, since 2019, actually probably since COVID, it's now obesity rates are going up exponentially. So yeah, it's the the clear disconnect between the two entities, which people need to be more mindful of. Yeah.
Are you talking obesity worldwide or just in Canada?
Worldwide.
Ah, mhm.
Yeah. Every country in the world, with the exception of possibly one or two, has soaring rates of obesity now. It's 1 in 2 in the United States. And it's about 1 in 3 in UK and Europe, but we're closely catching up with the Americans.
Yeah, Australia's doing really well as well, aren't we, Dave? I reckon on obesity. Yeah, it's great.
Dr. Tiller, on that point, actually, I've always found it interesting that a standard retort from anti-vaxxers and other science-based healthcare deniers is that, oh, well, we've kept following the doctor's recommendations, mainstream doctors' recommendations, and look, society's only getting sicker and fatter. Now, I actually was so irritated by that, I made a meme about it a few weeks ago where I cited various sources. First, I had the claim, and then I had the evidence showing no, it's actually because people are consistently ignoring what the doctors are telling them. They're not listening to the doctors about, the best ways to look after their basic health, exercise, fresh air, and that kind of thing. They're not eating the recommended balanced diets that doctors say they should be eating. You can find plenty of studies demonstrating this. So I find it really interesting that on the one hand, the health and wellness people are saying, look, if you just stick to what we're telling you, it'll be okay, because look at what the doctors are not telling you. That's not working. But on the other hand, it can be so easily shown that it's not that what the doctors are saying isn't working. It's that people aren't listening to them. They're not doing what they're meant to be doing.
Right. Well, obesity specifically is an extremely complex, multifaceted public health problem, and it's underpinned by all sorts of genetic, psychobiological, psychological, sociocultural factors. So it's impossible to get to the root of that in the short time that we have. But just one example, one thing that people can be doing is being more physically active. And the physical activity recommendations are agreed upon by pretty much all scientific and federal government organizations around the world. And the physical activity guidelines are very conservative. They're very modest. And only about 25% of the population actually meet those physical activity guidelines for various reasons. And the number one reason that people give is not having enough time, which again is a discussion for another occasion. But yeah, to your point, we're not doing even the basic things that we need to be doing in order to improve population health. Whereas the people who are peddling alternative therapies and other pseudosciences, they will say, well, you can take this pill and lose weight. You can follow this particular exercise. Eat grapefruits every day. Drink celery juice, and it's going to help you to burn fat. I saw a product on Amazon recently, which was it was a pair of infrared earrings that emit infrared energy and help to shrink your body fat cells. And it's got these wonderful pictures of body fat shrinking down, and the earrings are kind of emitting this kind of Wi-Fi signal, and it's just absolutely wonderful. You can buy them, they're like $20 or something, and people love the idea that you can just spend a bit of money on something, that there is one weird trick to busting belly fat. And it's the thing that scientists don't want you to know. It's the thing that is infuriating. It's the clickbait headlines, essentially. And this is something that's why these things are wildly popular, because eating well and exercising, being physically active is very time and effort intensive, whereas spending $20 on a pair of infrared earrings is very, very easy. It's a very complicated subject, and there are lots of factors to consider here, but the interventions that are most likely to work to improve population health are not going to be things that work overnight. Unfortunately, the reality is it requires time, and it requires some kind of effort and some kind of investment. These are the only things that are going to lead you to positive outcomes.
Well, thank you very much again for your time, Dr. Tiller. John, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, I think that's going to wrap up our episode today. I want to say thank you to all of our guests who decided to come. Everybody had excellent points. We learned a great deal today, and I just want to extend our gratitude for showing up.
This was so much fun. So great. Thank you for including me.
My pleasure.
It's been an absolute pleasure to be on. Thank you so much for having us. I'll speak for everybody. I don't know why I said that. I meant me. Thanks for having me. Anyway.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for being here.